Hello,
Hey, how's it going?
doing good. How about you?
I'm good. You're kind of quiet though.
Oh, wait, this is happening once more.
Oh, what is that? It's using a wrong mic or something?
Uh, it seems to be using the right one. How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Was it just it needed to be closer to your face or something?
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah, it's really irritating. Zoom's behavior for me, it's really like I couldn't find any patterns to figure out what's going on or wrong so that I can fix it. It's like trial and error every time.
And other uh, meeting apps, you don't need to do the
No,
same thing.
no.
That's interesting because like microphone volume is like hardware level basically,
Yeah.
or the pickup intensity at least. I guess you can always boost it, but thought the OS mostly did that.
Yeah, it's
Is what now?
uh
Oh,
sorry. It's
uh,
it's it's irritating. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
what did you tweak to raise your volume? Is there just a knob somewhere?
I just brought microphone little closer to my mouth,
Hmm.
but yeah, in the settings I can see the volume for the output and microphone as well. So I'm assuming if I reduce the volume, uh, it will like taper down the intensity of my voice, or at least the frequency at which it picks up my voice.
Hmm. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I can also see if you talk while you're looking at the mic, you can see the at the input level. You can see
Yeah,
the saturation you have.
yeah.
I, d- I don't see volume settings actually for in Zoom, just output level.
Oh, I so the input level, like the field input level, right below it, I see the volume thing.
Interesting. Oh, maybe it's because I'm using the web app.
Oh, yeah, could be.
Actually, you might try the web app. Maybe that would have more predictable behavior.
Yeah, I never tried it. I'll keep in mind. App seems much easier than web app. Like I get sometimes browser tabs gets like I lose the browser tabs, and then it's hard figuring out where the Zoom meeting was.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, Google's Meet thing started doing this neat thing where I get like a little preview whenever I lose focus. So it's there's still like a mini Meet window basically.
Oh, that's a nice feature to have, because like as usual I have 2 3 browsers window on, and each of them has like 15 20 tabs open. So it's easier to lose meeting windows.
Right, and you can still kind of see people's faces if you need to be looking
Yeah,
at two other things at once, too.
yeah, that's nice. Yeah, so Sartesh and Rita are not gonna be here for first half of the meeting.
Oh, they
uh
bailed? What?
yeah, so
We could kind of use the time, I guess, to see if we're on the same page or not. That might save time uh,
yeah,
when they show up.
yeah. uh yeah, so I'm still confused on what is our front runner. Seems like till this point all the discussions have been about available options, but there is no front runner yet, right?
Well, I know what I like. I can't say if other people agree with me,
Yeah,
but personally, what I would do is move the setting into the engine for the constraint template level annotation. I mean, move that into the engine. Remove the constraint level annotation entirely. Uh, have a separate enforcement point for webhook based admission and regular admission. But unless you're using the scoped enforcement actions, both of those will be included anyway.
yeah,
Does that make sense?
yep, yep, yeah. That treats yeah, that treats VAP as EP, just like every every other enforcement point. So I do have one question. When you
Mm-hmm.
say move VAP property into the engine, you mean removing the removing the label from constraint template and have it under spec?
Yeah, well, I would put it under the source code for the engine.
Oh, okay. So uh under source you would have a field per engine to see or to say to use VAP or not.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
because the engine's like governing generation anyway.
Yeah,
So I think we were trying to be a little bit too I don't know what the word is, cute maybe. Like we're trying to we were throwing more complexity at the problem than the problem actually had.
yeah,
Right? Like I'm just a lot of times if you just like try to figure out like what these things actually are and what they're responsible for, the design kind of falls out of it, you know?
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like this approach. Like it certainly makes sense to do that. Mm,
Yeah, and for me this is also like avoiding making the same kind of mistake that we made with not having room for scoped enforcement actions in the first
yeah,
place and for contemplating or conflating, sorry, the targets of gatekeeper admission versus like shift left slash audit.
yeah. Cool. I I I think I like that approach. And
Okay, cool. So now we'll see if Rita and
yeah,
Sartesh agree.
yeah. Okay, so like meanwhile we can decide on at least names of the uh, gatekeepers enforcement point and VIP's enforcement point.
I mean, we can propose.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
propose, not decide. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Sure.
so
So
I think this is what I had in mind.
let's see. So you got validation.gatekeeper.sh, vap.k8s.io, audit.gatekeeper.sh, gator.gatekeeper.sh. Do. This makes sense, I think. See, I was thinking a bit about Gator for a second, but no, I think that makes sense. Like if we ever have a different shift left mechanism, then it should just have a different name, probably.
Yeah.
Um, and the other one I'm just thinking validation.gatekeeper.sh versus validation.k8s.io or validatingwebhook.k8s.io, but I think it makes sense for Gatekeeper to own that for sure, because we own a lot of the syntax, right? Like we throw a lot of sugar
Yeah.
on top of validating admission webhook. Like, not that we don't for VAP though, right? Like we kind of like provide more matchers than VAP does, right? You can match against kind. It'll do like glob matching against namespace, that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on the host name
Okay.
bit, but I don't know if I have a strong opinion either way either. Like, in some ways, calling everything .gatekeeper.sh leaves room for Kubernetes to do something here if they ever want to, right? Like the point of the host name is to leave namespace free, basically, and avoid collision.
Hmm.
Um, so another way of looking at it might be that it's the author of the enforcement, or sorry, the author of the code that owns the host name, not the author of the notion of the enforcement point.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think it will matter too much either way. Maybe that plus consistency mitigates again toward gatekeeper.sh, but we could see if Rita or Sutesh have strong opinions. Did you have any opinions on it?
Uh, I I think if Gatekeeper is owning the logic behind how webhook and everything is interpreting admission requests and stuff, those things should be owned by Gatekeeper, and the ones that are like, so that's why for Gatekeeper's webhook, gatekeeper.sh makes sense to me, because looking at it I can tell that this webhook or enforcement point action, or sorry, enforcement point is accessing uh, Gatekeeper's logic, and then vap.k8s.io is accessing inbuilt Kubernetes validation logic. So that's what my reasoning was.
Yeah. Let me see. Do we have the original design doc handy? Let me see if I can find it. For scoped enforcement actions. I just want to refresh myself as to what's included in it.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, cool. Thank you.
Let me find it also.
See, I
I
think.
think it will be linked in the PR itself.
Yeah, that's not the right one. Oh, did we should probably put the design doc, a link to it in the docs folder.
I Oh, is it not in the docs folder?
Maybe it is. Maybe I just was assuming it wasn't. Docs design.
Yeah, here it is. Wait.
Oh, I meant there's a docs page in the Gatekeeper repo, not the
The folder. Oh,
drive
it's.
folder.
Oh, okay, okay. I
Um, Although I
May
really need to like, can you chat the link to the drive folder? Let me bookmark it because I keep.
I may have missed adding it to the design doc. Uh, but so yeah, that's the
Yeah, if you could chat the link to the drive
I
folder when you have a chance.
I
It doesn't need to
think I
be.
did.
Oh, you chatted the link to the doc. Uh,
Oh,
like that.
drive folder. Okay, okay, yeah, yeah. I think this is it.
Yeah, it should be either in development or proposed if it was there.
Yeah, I'll add it there.
But so we're just scoping the enforcement actions, right? This is not match criteria, right? Okay, okay.
Mhm.
Um, so we're really just saying like which enforcement actions the enforcement point supports. Okay. Um, yeah, I think that makes sense. Then, like, honestly, you could talk me into either host name, and I'd probably be fine with it.
Yeah, cool. I need to. I'll then just update this document as well, eliminating the rest of the uh, options, and then yeah, let's just wait around and see what Tess and Rita thinks.
Yeah, I uh, I like that we're this all seems to hold together. You
So
know, there doesn't seem to be any like edge cases that we're needing to work around by adding like an additional flag or something like that.
so I have one more questions, right? Like, why do we want to, if we want to treat VAP as EP, why do we want that property in the template source engine or like as well? Because for other EPs, the control is by default on, and then like with scope DA, if you want, you can disable it for constraint. So
Yeah, the concern would be that if there's some kind of if there's some constraint template that is causing on cluster problems merely by existing, right? Like you could imagine, let's say there's some uh, source code of death or something, right? Like if you write your cell in a certain way, you get a nil pointer and the API server crashes or something like that.
okay.
Um, then this would provide without being able to turn off code generation on a per template level. Your only other option is to just turn off VAP entirely, right?
Uh,
uh, or VAP generation entirely. So it's more about being able to handle like operational emergencies and maybe for like users to do phased rollouts when they start using VAP to kind of take it template by template and make sure that everything stays healthy.
so, but so that's my follow-up question. Like, why would somebody want a faulty constraint template to run? Uh,
So it's not necessarily that the constraint template is faulty, right? You can have a bug, let's say, in the cell parser code, right, where valid cell causes a crash, and you could come up with a scenario where, because Gatekeeper is on, say, a different version of the cell libraries than Kubernetes, uh, that uh, Gatekeeper does not crash, but Kubernetes does, for instance.
Okay.
Like it's definitely speculative, but that's all like disaster readiness, right? Is you anticipate what could go wrong and what would need to be there to make mitigating the problem easier. And so it's not that I have some specific concern, right? That you know this constraint template to VAP object generation pipeline will like obviously cause issues or something like that. It's more that if it does cause some problem at some point as an ops person, what is the most targeted thing I can do to get out of whatever the problematic situation is to mitigate it, uh, while affecting as little of production as possible.
Mm. Okay. So then sounds like by default we would want to, like, if the property is not defined, we would want the templates to have VAP enabled by default, and then it would be an exclusion just as any other enforcement points, right?
Yeah, I would think so. And like gating the behavior as a whole, that can be done via a flag. So I think we keep the same like shape of logic that we've already written for the alpha, but we streamline it a little bit. Users no longer get to choose a default, which I think is fine long term. And we're still using flags to gate overall behavior.
What do you mean by users still don't get to use a default? Like
Users
choose
no
the
longer get to choose a default. So in the alpha, there is when you're talking about interpreting a label and the presence or absence thereof, there's a flag that users can currently set that says absent this label existing,
Oh, okay, okay,
assume that use VAP is set or not.
okay.
Um,
Yeah,
this
that makes sense.
Yeah.
If we are removing the labels and using a property, missing value on property would be default inclusion of the template as for inconsistent with other behaviors for other enforcement points.
Yeah, yeah. So the only real objection I could see to this would be like wanting phased rollouts when starting to use VAP. Um, I'm not sure what per template phased rollouts get you, to be honest, because like the mere existence of a template, like what that does is it creates a policy definition, which should be an inert object in VAP world. Uh, so really, it's the constraint, right? Where if you want to like gradually shift the volume of enforcement or the number of requests that get shunted over to VAP as opposed to the webhook, uh, that's where you would be looking. The phasing the rollout. Oh, good.
Oh no, I didn't say anything.
Oh, sorry. I thought I heard you say something. Phasing the rollout, right? Basically, you're just chopping up the risk of, okay, template one, make a VAP object out of it, Everything good? Okay, cool. Template 2, everything good? Okay, cool. The problem with that is because it's meant to be an inert object, is that something not going well either is already constrained only to that template, right? So you're not killing the cluster as a whole, or it's sorry, or it's downing everything, right? So you're not reducing risk there. There is like maybe a concern about, so if your constraints are defaulting to generate VAP bindings and your templates are defaulting to generating VAP bindings as well, if you're failing closed, that could be an issue, but we're not going to fail closed out of the gate on VAP because that's there's this bug around. There's a race condition where if a CRD, I'm forgetting the exact details. It's that bug read a file. Do you remember?
Yeah, but I don't remember the details of that bug as well.
Yeah, it's around the parameter objects. Basically, there's some sort of sequence or timing issue where you can get at least temporary hard downs, essentially, for like all requests for whatever the binding is would fail. The maybe difference here is like try run versus deny as well. But the labels weren't going to address that anyway, right? And actually scoped. You know what? Scoped enforcement actions is perfect for that because you could set it to dry run in VAP, but deny for the webhook. And so you can kind of do a delta and make sure you're still getting identical enforcement metrics.
But there is no, like, in VAP there is no enforcement point as sorry, enforcement action as dry run. It only has uh, deny, warn, and audit.
Right. Sorry, warn. I forget what the audit enforcement action does. That just like writes something to the K8s audit logs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So we can maybe consider that dry run. I don't know. Sorry, my cat just typed in your doc here. Um, but yeah, okay. Then warn. Like the important bit there was some kind of non-enforcing, non-rejecting enforcement action.
Hmm.
Hi, cat. No, you can't gnaw on my glasses. All right, my cat decided to pay me a visit. Does that answer your questions though, or?
Yep.
Yeah, I think out of all of this, we actually wind up with something a little bit more suited for phased rollouts. It's like higher touch. Like the advantage of labels is you can use kubectl to filter basically. So it's like very clear which constraint is in which state. But you know, now it's like properly part of the schema and can be documented in the oh cat, get off my keyboard. Hi. It can be documented in the OpenAPI schema, and we can have more granular control, like taking a different enforcement action depending on VAP or webhook.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm probably just killing time at this point, waiting for Rita and Surdesh.
Yeah, I do see they access the doc, so they should be here some time soon, I guess.
I see there's an Alpha Simpson.
Hello, guys.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. Okay, so I'm
Welcome.
just using a code. That's not my original name. So, yeah. I basically had a question that I wanted to ask you guys. So, can I ask now?
Yeah, ask away.
Okay, so basically we have this use case in which we want to, manage multiple Kubernetes clusters using one installation of Gatekeeper. And I read some of the documentation, and I think that maybe the uh, admission control or the validation webhook in which we basically specify the gatekeeper. There's this field called URL in which we basically direct to a gatekeeper. So I was thinking that maybe if we deploy gatekeeper onto some other Kubernetes cluster, and the cluster we want to manage is in some another environment, then we can use this validating webhook to kind of point it to our centralized gatekeeper to manage all of the or all of our Kubernetes cluster. So is something like this possible?
It's possible. Referential data would be a concern if you're looking to use the syncing data right and using those kind of constraints, because Gatekeeper will only connect to one cluster to like establish watches and stuff, and that would be the cluster that it's running in. Um,
Okay.
the other complication, though it's not a blocker, would just be certificate management. Um,
Okay.
in Because it's Gatekeeper has some internal logic to do certificate generation and rotation, and that's only going to be done on the managed cluster. And you could turn all that off if you have your own certificate management solution. Um, the last concern would be audit, because audit does not like audit uh, uh, basically it uses the connection to the API server to scan resources. And
Got it.
so just like for referential data, that's only going to connect to the cluster that it's running in. So
Okay.
you wouldn't get audit behavior. Whether that matters to you or not, I think is up to you.
Okay.
Um, you could rig up some kind of scheme where audit reaches out to remote clusters, right? If you can like hack the client config, but then you're left with the question of, well, where does Gatekeeper read its constraints and templates and all that from? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's not like infeasible. There is for some features you're kind of swimming upstream, and some might not be possible without code changes.
Okay. So, and we were also thinking for another solution. It was that if we deploy Gatekeeper into a cluster, we wanted all of our policies to be hidden from the actual users of the cluster.
Ah,
And yeah, we came across the solution that in which we can encrypt our resources, so that any user of the cluster won't be able to see our policies or constraint templates or the constraints. But there, the blocker that we faced was that the admin of the cluster will be able to even modify the encryption schemes. So he can just go into the encryption settings and simply disable the encryption policy, and then all of our constraint templates and constraints will become visible to the you know an admin of the cluster.
right. And they could just like delete the policy too if they have
Yeah,
the access, regardless of reading it.
yeah. So is there any solution to that problem? If we can hide our policies, then we can even deploy the gatekeeper in the cluster.
So, can I ask, what are you trying to? So, I heard, I'm hearing you want webhook enforcement, and you want to basically like hide policies from users so they can't see them, and I'm inferring modify them. Is that accurate?
Yep, so basically there are two scenarios. The end goal is that we want to hide our policies from the customer. If we are unable to hide the policies, if we deploy the gatekeeper in the cluster, then we want to, move the gatekeeper out of the cluster so that our policies are secure. But if
And
moving out,
those are good.
yep, if moving the gatekeeper out of the cluster is not feasible, then we will want to stick with the first option, which is that we want to deploy the gatekeeper inside the cluster, but we still want to secure our policies. Like we don't want the admin of the cluster or any user of the cluster to be able to see our policies or modify them on their own.
And are you interested in audit type enforcement or just webhook type enforcement?
Yep, I think both actually.
Okay. And are you using referential constraints or no?
Uh, I think not yet.
Okay. Uh, yeah, I don't think there's anything that like out of the box fits this use case. Like honestly, probably what would be interesting is if Gatekeeper or some other binary could read its config from disk, right? Like load the constraints and the templates and all that from
Okay.
disk, uh, and then operate as webhook and audit using some provided cluster config. And
Okay.
that kind of thing could run off cluster, right? Like as long as you can contact the API server,
Yep.
you could still do watches for like referential data, and you can use the discovery API and all that um, for running audit. Or if you're running on cluster, kind of the same deal, but then your config is hidden, right? Because it's on disk, and if you are able to keep kube system separate, right? Like in general, any kind of like webhook enforcement is made difficult by the fact that the validating webhook configuration is an on cluster object. So if you don't trust the cluster owner, uh, how do you lock that down?
Yep.
Um, yeah, that again, that doesn't exist today, but I'm wondering how hard it would be and what would be different. Like I could imagine basically you could take gatekeeper, you could disable the controllers, the constraint template, the constraint, the mutation, basically every controller but the audit controller and the sync controller. Uh, you would lose audit being reported on the resource itself, but that was never like a source of truth anyway. Like audit writes results to the constraint template is what I mean, or the constraint. And obviously there's no constraint to write to in this model, but the logs would still be there.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll think about that.
yeah,
Hey,
that would definitely be a fork. If
Okay.
you knew which knobs to hit, it would not necessarily be too heavy a lift, I don't think, but definitely not trivial.
Okay. Got it. Rita, do you want to say something?
Oh, sorry, I didn't see the hand.
yeah, it's okay. I was just typing as well. I don't want to interrupt. Yeah, I was just wondering, since you want to like, I guess, hide the policy from the users, is there a way you can leverage RBAC rules to make sure only certain users can have certain access to resources in the gatekeeper namespace?
I think we can do that, but one concern there is that the admin has access to all of the cluster. Even if we have deployed the gatekeeper inside their cluster, but still the admin has the access to everything. So okay, they can just go into the RBAC and change the configuration there.
I see.
So
So it's not just hiding from other users, that you actually want to hide it from the cluster admins.
yep, yep.
Oh,
So basically, we want to provide some kind of a solution that you know um, we give users a predefined policies or something that they can use to build upon stuff, but we don't want them to see those actual policies, because if they are able to see the policies and modify the policies, then our solution won't be as much appealing, or we won't be able to sell it. So
Yeah,
right.
I think the validating webhook configuration is the most vulnerable point in all of this. Like even if you're running off cluster, that still needs to exist, right? To configure the API server to reach out.
One idea is you could host something outside the cluster and continuously reconcile these resources on the cluster. So even if a user were to muck with it, it will get overwritten.
mm,
But that would have to
okay.
be obviously off cluster.
Yeah, and if you had like an authorization webhook, which I think you can hard code those, right, Rita? Like you can authorization webhooks you can configure
Yeah,
statically.
you can configure only certain users can do stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that you could say, hey, if someone's touching the validating webhook configuration, don't let them unless they are, me or whoever.
Okay.
Um,
Okay, I think in that case we can even deploy our resources or even the gatekeeper inside the cluster, and then we can secure it with as you mentioned, that validating webhook. If someone is trying to tamper with that, then we don't allow that.
so I want to be like real specific here. Authorization webhook, because that's a separate
Uh,
webhook. Here, let me Kubernetes authorization. And one thing to know about authorization webhooks is that they should not be running on cluster,
okay.
uh, because there's a circular dependency concern there. At least that was the wisdom, 3 or 5 years ago when last we looked at this. Uh, but yeah, I think this is. Yeah. Okay, the subject access review. Yeah, this documentation I just linked you to. That's an example of an authorization webhook. It does require you to have access to the cluster config.
Okay, got it. I'll read that.
Yeah, I just documented some of these discussions in the meeting notes so you can refer back to it.
Yeah, okay, sure. Also, I can ping you guys as well, right? It's no problem if you don't mind.
Yeah. We're
Okay.
on Slack. I am bad about looking at channels. So if you at me directly.
Yeah, I was talking about pinging you guys directly if I have other questions. Also, I'll do some more R&D, and we'll try to be available. We'll try to join the next meeting to share the update with you guys and see where things stand.
Yeah, be curious.
Are you able to run these off the cluster? Because as you can see, all the suggestions are basically pointing to off the cluster, right? Even with the authorization webhook.
Uh, we haven't, practically run anything yet. We were just doing R&D. Uh,
Okay,
Actually, only R in except for D because we haven't started development. We want you to see if things are feasible before proceeding further. So,
Yeah, I think you're not the first person to ask about the sort of side loading of policy in a way that's invisible for sure.
yeah,
It's not like a thing we hear weekly, but it's a thing I've heard before.
yeah. So basically, there was this solution that Trino recently uh, rolled out, in which they uh, allow the integration of OPA for authorization of the resources. So there we basically have the flexibility to host our policies directly on GitHub repo. It can be a private or a public repo. In case of private repo, we will need to have access to private and public keys, respectively. So if something similar were to be present here, then we could offload our policies onto a private GitHub repository, and the gatekeeper could directly reference those. But I think that's not possible at the moment.
Yeah, not currently, and there's some UX roughness around like audit violations and how people would handle those probably. But I think for the use case that I'm hearing from you, the biggest challenge would be how do you hand over cluster admin without handing over cluster admin, right? Like you kind of want to give them root in cluster, except these certain resources, right?
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
a pretty challenging. Validating admission policy, although you said you didn't want them visible on the cluster, so that could be an issue. But like validating admission policy with RBAC, again, you're not going to get audit, but you would avoid this webhook configuration bit. And I think you can use VAP to lock down RBAC as well. Pretty sure that's accurate. But then you need something that's like just short of cluster admin too.
yeah. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So anyway, with even if you use the Caverno thing, I think that uh, the you still need a solution for preventing the webhook config from being modified.
Yeah, that's the basically main problem, because anything that's deployed on the client's cluster, they can change it, because we cannot restrict them.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
authorization
okay.
webhooks are, as far as I know, the most lockdown way of trying to do something like what is needed there. And then Rita's suggestion of having an insistent reconciliation is like a close second. The main difference being with reconciliation, you can like force brief moments where the webhook isn't called just by like fighting the reconciler.
Got it.
Right. Like create your own controller that deletes the webhook and they just like flap back and forth.
Yeah. Yep.
Anyway, did we want to go back to the VAP stuff and just see if you agree with what me and Jay were talking about?
Sure.
All right. Did you want me to go, Jay, or did you want to go?
Yeah, I can go.
Okay.
So what we discussed was that instead of having annotations on constraint template and constraint, we should move it under engine and have a property there per constraint to indicate whether or not to enable VAP or not. By default, if the field is missing, the behavior is inclusion as in line with other enforcement points, and then use like for constraint, if the template doesn't indicate that VAP shouldn't be enabled, we have VAP enabled in the constraint itself by default, and with the scope EA, of course, in line with other enforcement points. So that's the idea about how to treat VAP as enforcement point. Did I miss anything?
No, yeah. So just I think what you said is put a field in the VAP engine that is it's set to enable VAP generation by default. That users can use that to disable VAP generation on a per template basis. So basically, that label that we have that moved down to a field on the engine, and then for constraints, rather than having a label, if people want to disable VAP using this JDIP's new scoped enforcement actions, because VAP is an enforcement point, they could just disinclude VAP like they would do if they didn't want to include a constraint in audit or whatever.
Right. And how would I disinclude? I'm reading the doc, sorry.
For a constraint template or for a constraint?
Both.
For a constraint template, you would modify the constraint template and add a field like spec.targets.source.disable VAP generation equals true or something like that.
Okay, so
And
that's something new you want to add to framework?
no, just the engine in framework, the VAP engine itself.
Yeah, that's what I meant by framework, right?
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. It would live next to the VAP source code.
That's right. Yeah. So it will be I just want to confirm it's like a new thing under the VAP engine, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
And we would get rid of the flags that introduces default behavior for annotations on gatekeeper side. Like if the annotations are not included, what do you want the behavior to be? Those flags will be removed, and the by default behavior for the field would be, if not in mentioned
Okay.
specifically, you would enable VAP.
Right. So in this case, if I want to use if I want the generation, I'll just add the VAP K8s IO thing under enforcement points, right?
If you're not using scoped enforcement actions, by
Mhm.
default, you would get it, because without scoped enforcement actions,
Mhm.
we assume all enforcement points are included.
Yeah, I don't, that might be kind of, it's sort of opt out instead of opt in. I think when the VAP feature is like GA ready, that makes sense, right? But even at beta state, and right now we're alpha, but I think are you suggesting for beta it would be opt out as well?
Well, I think we have a flag that would disable VAP generation globally. So,
Okay, so you
yeah.
will still have that flag. Okay, the gatekeeper default thing, right?
Not so much the default thing. It would just be like, do we call the generation code at all, ever, regardless of what you've specified in the constraint and template?
Mm,
Like, basically a flag that's like enable VAP generation, and it's defaulting to false until we want to default it to true because it's GA.
yeah, I kind of like how it is right now in that the individual policy owner gets to decide if they want to generate or not.
That would still be
By
possible,
adding
right?
Hmm?
That would still be possible with the property inside engine, right?
Well, you're opting out. At that point, you're opting out because you're saying by default you are going to enable. So basically, the default is all or nothing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I am. I mean, unless I'm reading this wrong.
Well, the default behavior, I all or nothing is kind of hard to think about, because that was always kind of the end goal of all of this anyway, right? Like, the thought was kind of a phased rollout, right? With these labels, where you start out with no VAP generation whatsoever, right? And then you would enable VAP, just the engine. So Gatekeeper's still evaluating, but there's no VAP generation. And then you would enable VAP generation, but you would set the default interpretation to off for those labels. And then the admin could basically like slowly roll out.
Yeah, the opt-in way.
Yeah. And so in that model, though, is if you have authors of individual constraints or templates, right, they're still beholden to whoever's running Gatekeeper, right? The person running Gatekeeper could bring them all along, right? Unless they took an affirmative action to disable by applying that label. So this,
I'm sorry, I do have to drop for another community call. But can we continue this in the doc? I feel like we're getting closer. But at a sort of the immediate question I have is for the upcoming 3.16 release. I think our milestone date is next Wednesday, basically, or next week. So are we ready to cut for 3.16?
I think for alpha, like, if we're okay with this label behavior potentially changing, then sure. If we're like, oh, that's too breaking of a change, then we should know what we want to do with this,
Right.
before cutting it.
How about let's just say let's make a decision before end of Friday. Let's keep chatting about it on Slack, I guess.
Okay, like
I
I'm,
think my only holdup is the default, the opt-in versus opt-out behavior. So in the new proposal for VAP as an enforcement point, I'm totally okay with it if we can ensure before GA it's an opt-in, not an opt-out.
I think we might want to like workshop what we mean by opt-in, opt-out, like who,
Opt-in
what are
as in
who are
at
the
the
parties?
policy level. Opt-in at the policy level, right? That's what I mean.
Right. So there's some personas, there's some details missing there in terms of like the personas, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's continue the discussion in the doc and on Slack. And then let's make a decision on, you know, do we want to wait or do we want to just cut the release as is?
Gotcha. And which doc is this that we're having the discussion on? The one JDIP
Yes,
it mentioned in Slack?
that's right. And Jay, if you could, for option one and whatever other option you have, if you can include the, you know, what is the behavior for alpha, beta, and GA, I think that would also help.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll modify the doc.
All right, sounds great. Thank you so much. All right, bye.
Bye.
Okay. See you all later.
Yep. See ya.